Hello there once again and welcome to this edition of Beyond the News on BTV. On the 25th of May 1963, over 30 African nations gathered in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, then led by Emperor Haile Selassie. By this time, over 2/3 of the African nations had gotten their independence from the European nations, who were at that time their colonial masters. The aim of this meeting was to completely decolonize countries like Angola. But at the top of the agenda was the creation of a charter that would bring African nations together and, of course, crave for development on the continent. In this edition of Beyond the News, we are taking you through the celebration of the African Day and its impact on the African continent. You're welcome to this edition.
Television,
where it all begins.
Welcome back to this edition. I am Innocent You in Kumba. Now, that charter was signed by all the African nations who were present except Morocco. And on that particular charter, it was agreed that the 26th of May was going to be the African Day. In fact, the day for African unity. The day when Africans were going to crave independence. But how has Africa been able to work out independence right to present day Africa is what we should examine in this excerpt.
Leaders from over 30 African countries gathered in Ethiopia with one goal in mind: the emancipation of Africa. And what has endured through it all is this: the Union, the African Union, a masterclass in cooperation. Its work has reduced conflict, elevated best practice models through the African peer review mechanism, and created critical collaboration across 8 economic regional communities. May this convention of union last 1,000 years. We all play our part in celebrating Africa's greatness, not because we live on its soil, but because our soul is at home in Africa. One African country after the other fought for and gained their independence and their freedom. That fight is not done. We celebrate Africa Day this year remembering our hard-won victories and pushing onward to create the Africa we want.
As Africa and the world face our biggest challenge in recent history with the COVID-19 pandemic, we must remember one thing. We are in this together. Your continent is fighting alongside each and every African, every step of the way. The African Union, chaired by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa this year, together with peer African leaders, has been hard at work to find lasting solutions that will ensure that Africa beats this and any future pandemics to come. Through their united efforts, the African Union has raised over $60 million. Africa has shown unity and leadership in protecting its citizens and managing the spread of the pandemic with world-class expertise and resolve. We have called for debt repayments to be paused and even cancelled, freeing up billions of dollars to fight COVID-19. Africa is united. Together, we will overcome.
And here again today, the African continent that is plagued by wars, series of upheavals, underdevelopment, and many think that the colonial masters have still not left the African continent. The present-day African Union seems to be a shadow of itself, unable to solve many problems in Mali, Angola, the Central African Republic, and Cameroon, not also left out. And the cry among many Africans is to stop the war, but not without some Africans who themselves have decided to keep child soldiers. Soldiers who fight for their own selfish aims and not for the continent. This essay was put together about a man called Joseph Kony that was indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity and for keeping child soldiers. Watch this.
The warlord Joseph Kony is believed to be hiding out in the borderlands of the Central African Republic, where more than 15 armed groups are fighting to control the country's resources. As head of the Lord's Resistance Army, Kony has been indicted by the International Criminal Court for, among other crimes, abducting and recruiting children.
I did not abduct anybody, and there's no any children in my position or in my camp.
According to the United Nations, over the last 5 years, at least 13,000 children in the Central African Republic have been kidnapped and turned into soldiers.
One of the most powerful rebel groups here is the Popular Front for the Renaissance of the Central African Republic, or the FPRC. It's made up of people from the country's Muslim minority, who fought the Lord's Resistance Army many times. They claim that they don't use child soldiers, but while we were there, we met 2 boys who'd been captured after separate battles with rival groups. Instead of being released, they've been made to fight. We spoke with Mohamed Said, a founding member of the FPRC and one of its most senior generals in Bria.
Can you describe what happened when you fought with the LRA and captured the young fighter?
Les gens de la LRA sont venus appréhender, veut dire attraper les personnes dans leur village. C'est à cause de ça qu'ils sont en train de circuler et chercher à monopoliser cette zone. Ils arrachent seulement les vivres, les enfants, et le bagage c'est fini, ils partent. C'est à cause de ça qu'on avait pris nos hommes pour pouvoir les poursuivre. Et puis, ils se sont combattus et ils ont récupéré les enfants.
Didier used to be with the LRA, and Abakar was taken from the anti-Balaka forces.
Can
you describe some of the things you had to do? And the new kidnapped people, that was other children who'd been kidnapped, who were being trained to fight as well.
Abakar was captured 7 months ago. He says he was 17 at the time.
What did they do to everybody else?
Yala fuzamba minala fambi de chala ke. Ala fazu mingi. Nia hanga tsala fanga zusala. Kate gechiri. Fazu. Ipikiri.
And now you're fighting for the FPRC. How do you think this is going to end?
Solombingam.
And do you want to stay here and keep fighting, or do you want to go home?
Mbi continue gaturugu.
Did they ever say what would happen to you if you refused to fight or refused to do any of the work they wanted you to do? And did that happen? Were there kids who refused or were too scared to fight and who were killed? Did you ever meet or see Joseph Kony? The Americans sent troops here looking for him. The Ugandans sent troops here looking for him. They spent many millions of dollars. They had lots of equipment. Why do you think they were unable to catch him?
Là sini inga tia mikitabla jusqu'à voilà go aba mbeni kiki so beni vurukamba na teretela wala kibina nduzwa atene litanga na turayala.
When you were fighting for the LRA, you had no choice because if you didn't, you would be killed. What do you think you're fighting for now, here? But when was the last time you saw your family? Why can't you hand the young fighter over? He says he's 17 years old now, but he was captured when he was 10. Can he not be returned to his family in Congo?
Non, on va le remettre. Actuellement, il a 18 ans. Mais nous, il ne nous intéresse même pas. Ce qui est là, on a envoyé actuellement à ses parents au niveau du Zaïre, du Congo démocratique. On a déjà écrit et envoyé. Si ses parents sont venus, on va le remettre officiellement à leurs parents.
4 months after we filmed this interview, Didier and Abakar remain hostages of the FPRC, with no news about when or if they will be allowed to return to their families.
You are watching Beyond the News on Blossom Television, and the Organization of African Unity was replaced by the African Union. And within this particular period, a lot has happened on the African continent. When we come back, we shall talk with a professor of history on this particular subject of African liberation and the celebration of African Day and its impact on us. I'll be right back after this. And you are still on to Beyond the News. And just coming up will be our guest of the day, Sapir Sivion Jambe. He's a professor of history. Welcome back, and we take our guest for this edition of Beyond the News. And Prof, you're welcome to this edition. We're talking about the African Day celebration on the 26th of May, and you must have noticed a lot of discussion across the continents with civil society organizations, and many talking about the colonization of Africa. Do you think the African Day celebration is of any significance to Africans and to the African continent?
Well, thank you for that question. We are talking about the 1964s, where this day was put in place by the politicians at the time, the forefathers of independence, notably Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Nnamdi Azikiwe, and a host of many in Africa at the time. Okay, the idea behind the celebration of African Day was to commemorate, the victory that they had to oust the European imperialists from the African continent. Okay, but if I come to your question, does it have any significance to Africa and Africans today? I will say yes to an extent and no to a greater extent. Yes, in the fact that it makes us think of our suffering, the suffering that Africans had in the hands of these colonial masters, be they the British, the Germans, the Portuguese, the Belgians, the Italians, and the rest you can name them. So we think of the suffering that African was for decades of years. And at the dawn of the 1960s, immediately after, we say that immediately after the Second World War in 1945, and by 1948, when Indochina, of course, happened to launch a war against France, and defeated them. And the wind of change for independence blew across Africa. I'm talking of Africa south of the Sahara, where Ghana, which was formerly known as the Gold Coast, celebrated their independence in 1957, with at the helm of that country as Kwame Nkrumah. So we are thinking of the hardship, the segregation, the loss of African identity by the Europeans at the time. So we can now, give an oof of relief that at last Africans could go back to their independent state that they were before colonialism.
Prof, there is a certain kind of democracy that is practiced on African continent today, of course. In Cameroon, we talk about democracy advancée. And we all know that what African leaders are trying to do today in the form of balloting elections is a copycat from the European nations out there, those who actually colonize them. Do you think that the form of democracy vis-a-vis the independence of these African nations has anything to do with the development of the continent, or you think that independence makes sense to the Africans themselves, especially those in leadership?
Yeah, did it have any meaning? Yes and no. Yes, in the fact that these colonial masters who were in every facet of life in Africa could now leave, and Africans would take the place of leadership. Africans could now become, presidents of certain movements in Africa or in their own home government, which were formerly headed by these Europeans. No, in the sense that the independence that Africans had, like Kwame Nkrumah put it in 1957, he put it in this way. He said, Africa and Ghana is celebrating independence today. He call it paper independence, because the economy of Africa was still and is still in the hands of the metropoles. So I will join my view with that of Kwame Nkrumah to say that today the independence of Africa has no relevance to the Africans because Europeans have come back to Africa in what we call in history neo-colonialism, another form of colonialism. This time around, okay, they use our mentality, the African mentality, to colonize Africans the more. They are manipulating the political activities of Africa, the social and the economy, okay? And of course, he who plays the drum determines the dance in the arena.
Okay, now I'm just going to embarrass you with this question. It might look like an embarrassment, but you look at the African leaders themselves who are there. Africa, plenty of wars, lots of discrepancies, and some stay in power for very, very long periods, and sometimes we have them go out and their family lineage gets on and things like that. You've seen the present situation on the African continent out there. And someone might be tempted to say that the African leaders themselves are just a prototype or a photocopy of the European imperialists that are on. In fact, some have even described some of these leaders as colonialists. Do you buy with such ideas? Anything to them?
Thank you. African leaders were first of all, they were very much ill-prepared to take the leadership of their governments. Okay, they had been prepared, nurtured, I will say, unschooled by the Europeans for decades of years. Remember, in the traditional African society, there was nothing that was known as democracy. Democracy is a borrowed terminology from America. Okay, capitalism is a borrowed terminology from the Western world, from Europe. What we knew in Africa is dictatorship, where a king speaks and the subjects follow. Okay, now that independence came, and these newly breeded African leaders were trying to catch up the pieces of what they have learned from the colonial masters, and they were trying to force it on the people which could not work. If we had crisis in Africa today, it is because they are trying to make sure that democracy that should work, which cannot work, because back in their blood flows the aspect of dictatorship. They are Africans in the first place. But they are trying to put on a suit, a mask of American and European democracy, which cannot fit in the African societies, which we have inherited, or we inherited from our forefathers. Okay, that is why we have embezzlement and things, because we know capitalism, say for example, let the rich be rich and let the poor be poor. And that is why we see that today's leadership, or African leaders, they amass a lot of wealth at the detriment of those that they thought or they were supposed to have been leading. Okay, that is why the whole idea of African independence and the relevance of it to the Africans is a sham, because we have a photocopy of what Europe tried to put in here, which cannot fit with our African societies. Take for instance, in the domain of music, for example, what we have, I will call it the transfer of European system of music have taken away African traditional music. I remember in the days of slavery and slave trade, when Africans were taken from Africa here to America, what used to console the people were singing this good African music, and they will feel very much relaxed. But today, Ask a Cameroonian, for example, ask a Nigerian, for example, to play African music. What they will give you is hip hop, borrowed from the Western world. You look at politics. What do we have? Rigging of elections. What do we have in Africa? Electoral malpractices. Okay, non-respect to constitution that is signed by the people. All of that is to see that the leaders of Africa today, they do just what they are dictated upon by the metropoles.
Okay, now to this end, if you are a professor, you teach history, the history of Africa specifically, and maybe you're on the podium to present or to talk to the Africans on African Day or the African Week and tell them about the values of Africa, what will you, Prof, be telling them?
Let us go back to our roots. Let the youths go back to their roots. For God's sake, Africans are Africans. Africans can never be Europeans, because down in our vein flows the blood of Africans. Deep in our mind flows the mentality of Africans. Even in our color shows God was not a fool to make us dark people, and the other people, colored people, or skin, white or skin, or whatever we can call it. So let's go back to our roots and behave Africans. Behaving Africans does not mean, I want to say that we should not borrow the white man ideas, because the Europeans have come to make the Africans to know that they were backwards, that Africans were backward. No, remember, before Europeans could gain to the age of enlightenment, Africa had been in what we call the golden age of Africa, where Africa was the African cities were booming with a lot of development. You call it the old Ghana Empire, the great Zimbabwe Empire, the Egyptian civilization, where Europeans were coming and borrowing ideas of development from Africa. The art of writing itself started here in Africa. Okay, but what they did was to come and kill and destroy that which was in Africa, and they came now in another way to sell their ideas, and they came to tell us that they were bringing European civilization. What civilization? So civilization started in Africa. We should sell our civilization through music, through the arts of through education, through agriculture, through our identity as Africa, through our color. It bears nothing for a young girl to bleach herself to think that he can be like a white man. It serves nothing for an African to kill his language. If I speak the proper language, people will say I am backward, but that is what I am. I am an Moroccan man. I can say, that is being African and projecting African identity. Let's go back to our roots and behave Africa, and we see that Africa will bounce back to that glorious and golden age that we were.
Okay, Prof, thank you for having your time and taking your time off your very tight schedule to talk to us on African Day on Beyond the News on Blossom Television. And we had Sakwe Sevion Jambe, who just spoke to us about the significance of the African Day celebration on the 26th of May. And Africans are still in dire need of lots of development and enough to quell down the series of wars and contentions on the African continent. I have been Innocent You on Beyond the News, and catch you in the next edition.